Let me set the scene for you folks here. Waking up on a Saturday morning in the year 2000 was a treat. There was endless excitement and crazes starting up that were unlike anything that came before or after. Before mom and dad are up, you tiptoe out of bed, careful not to wake your siblings or stir up any suspicion that you might be up to anything. Saturday morning cartoons haven't quite started yet, and sunlight was barely creeping through the living room blinds, so you open up the entertainment center that houses your family's moderately sized tube TV just to see it staring back at you. One of the most influential pieces of technology of the mid-90s. Your Nintendo 64. It's not a stretch to say that this black box, or my watermelon red model, holds a special place in the hearts of hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. The Sony PlayStation may have won the console war, if we're talking about units sold, which is probably how we should be judging that, due in part to its more adult-themed games and marketing that helped move gaming into the late teens and young adults mainstream. But the new generation of gamers, my generation, was handed off the mantle of Nintendo's responsibility in 1996. When I was growing up, my first console was a Sega Genesis. Sonic, Vector Man, Strider, Golden Axe, Altered Beast. Absolutely stellar titles that my still developing soft-headed brain absorbed as not too much more than lights and sounds. It was my parents' console of choice before they'd had me, so it was what was in the house. That's right, I had gamer parents, and you probably didn't. Unless you play Fortnite with your dad, in which case he probably respects you more than mine does. I can't build a damn thing in that game other than a tower to my shame. Anyways, when I was 4, I got a console that would change my life forever. The console that got me absolutely enamored in the world of gaming. My N64. I was young and couldn't really read yet, but that didn't stop me from running around in the open world that was Ocarina of Time. I could barely figure out how to hold a 3-prong controller, and yet I still spent hours trying to beat that damn penguin slide in Mario 64. I only knew what I was doing thanks to the TV show, but I was sure to plug in my Game Boy into the Game Boy pack into the back of my controller and turn on Pokemon Stadium so I could play Pokemon Yellow. And you better believe that even though I didn't know that there was anything like tournaments for it, or tech skill, or illegal maps and items, I was always willing to have friends over and Falcon punch them into next Tuesday in some Smash 64. The N64 revolutionized gaming from its release and completely changed the way developers looked at gaming. Fully 3D, polygonal graphics, and a stellar library of some of gaming's greatest achievements graced its cartridge bay, and the way some of Nintendo's biggest series were to be looked at for the decades to come started on the N64. Mario Sunshine, Galaxy, and most recently Odyssey all trace their roots back more so to Mario 64 than they do to the Mario games of the previous 2 generations. Legend of Zelda, whilst essentially the same game but in 3D, revolutionized the way 3D graphics and open worlds would mingle with one another for generations of games to come. Every single game in the Zelda franchise on consoles after it followed its formula to a T. Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, all liked and disliked in their own ways, some more than others. Skyward Sword. But Ocarina of Time stands as an absolute masterclass in 3D game design. The Pokemon craze? That could be its own video, but it was absolutely right at home on the N64. If you were somehow lacking a Game Boy, which would have been bizarre at the time, or a Game Boy Color, you could still join in. Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2 brought your Pokemon to life on your TV in full 3D to battle it out. And Pokemon Snap let you capture Pokemon on film, so you could bring your cartridge to Blockbuster and print out your pictures as stickers while you decided between Banjo-Kazooie or Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 for your weekend rental, for those of you who still remember going to Blockbuster on the weekends. I know that I did, and I'm very sad that I can't anymore, but I'm also very sad that I can't look at the box before I rent the movie on Netflix or anything like that, because the box is special, goddammit. You looked at it on the way home from Blockbuster, in the car, by streetlight, and even though you couldn't read, you knew that the movie was going to be fantastic as you stared at the box of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie. Because that's the kind of kid I was. Nostalgia is a hard thing to completely escape from here, as you can probably tell. But now that I've gotten my rose-tinted ogling and oogling out of the way, let's take a step back and look at the proverbial game board that Nintendo was playing its ace on at the time. Nintendo, for the past 2 generations, had been the winner of the console wars, decided by sales and not kids in the playground who thought that Sonic was the coolest thing since Vanilla frickin' Ice. Nintendo had firmly put Sega in its place. Second. While Sega had some absolutely fantastic consoles, the 2 generations of hardware and a more controlled approach to game publishing under the firm guiding hand of Big Brother Nintendo had shown that it was clearly the superior choice. One thing that the Super Nintendo had even toyed with was superfluous 3D graphics, by use of its 3DFX chip. Mario Kart, Star Fox, and F-Zero being the most notable examples of its use. Nintendo knew that the next generation was going to be in full-fledged 3D, and the developers began to work at the differences between polygons and pixels. But Nintendo's fan base was growing older. Despite having saved gaming from the brink of destruction in the West from the infamous 80s video game crash, Nintendo's fans were quickly outgrowing them. If you were 5 when the NES had launched, by 1996, the launch of the N64, you were about 16. Much too old to be playing kiddie Nintendo games. At least that's what the folks back then thought. Nowadays, everyone on Earth has played a Wii and made themselves look stupid in front of a family member. Even remote tribes in the frickin' Amazon rainforest now settle territorial disputes with one another by staging Wii Sports boxing tournaments. To grow up as a Nintendo kid meant that your family recognized them as a family brand, a notion that stuck with Nintendo since its heyday. Nintendo built itself on the backs of enthusiastic children wanting to stomp on turtles and hunt for secrets in the gaping maw of old trees. They knew that they were known for that, and they would stick to their guns. This meant that the entire generation Nintendo had raised was leaving the nest, and as such, a new leader in the market came to take the forefront: Sony. If Nintendo was for the younger sibling, still in elementary school, and Sega was for the big cool middle sibling in middle school, Sony was gunning for the high schoolers and the still somewhat young college-age teens. Final Fantasy, Tomb Raider, Tekken, Silent Hill, Twisted Metal, and Resident Evil were clearly not geared towards little Timmy who still had to ride his bike with training wheels. No, Sony had made a console and geared it towards badass teenagers who wanted challenges and blocky polygonal titties. Looking at you, Lara Croft, but not like that. I don't want to get canceled. You deserve equal pay to Indiana Jones. Same job, same pay, you know? Nintendo was not huge on the idea of polygonal titties, and with Sega firmly out in left field doing whatever the hell it is they thought they were doing with the 32X and the Sega CD, Nintendo had to educate an entire generation of children whose parents had maybe been a little too old for the NES and the SNES, but knew the name and what the brand stood for. Nintendo was about to teach children the importance of depth perception on 10-inch CRT screens, and how moving in fully 3D spaces worked. Nintendo came out of the gate swinging with Pilot Wing 64 and Mario 64 as their 2 biggest launch titles in September of 1996. Instantly, audiences who picked it up were hooked. An interesting clip of a newscaster on a local Fox News channel I came across when doing research for this video poses the question about the controller that, in essence, asks, "Is this too much for my 7-year-old to understand?" She's quickly shown that it's not in seconds.
But just how easy is it to play Nintendo 64? After all, the controller looks like it could be used on some kind of military jet. Well, we took the system to a Nintendo expert, my son. It was his first time. I knew immediately I'd lost him. I tried to reach him.
Hello? Hello? Do you want me to show you?
But it was impossible.
While not actually analog, the N64 came packed with a tri-wing style controller that was split into what were essentially 2 modes. The first was the far left, a D-pad, useful for navigating menus and playing 2D games. For what was actually available on the console, this wasn't too common. In the middle was a single analog stick with a Z trigger on the back, and the start button just above. It wasn't actually analog. It was essentially a digital analog stick. On the right, nobody would ever have to move this hand. That side was where the buttons lived and breathed, both the A and the B buttons and the yellow C buttons, or arrow buttons if that's what you want to call them. Most commonly, games would pick one of these 2 configurations and stick with them. Upon starting a game, it would become swiftly apparent which gameplay option a game would use, and you'd likely never have to switch off. Obviously, if a 7-year-old can figure it out in just a few seconds, the controller couldn't have actually been that hard to use. Moments after release, the console was flying off store shelves. Anyone who's been on the internet for any amount of time will surely remember this clip of a kid opening an N64 for Christmas. Even by 1998, Nintendo was easily selling its consoles, but maybe not as easily as they had been with the Super Nintendo. The Sony PlayStation, unlike the Sega Saturn, wasn't vying for Nintendo's audience. The Saturn, on the other hand, was helping to split the sales of Nintendo's target audience. While the Nintendo 64 wasn't a failure by any metric, it was without question not the best-selling console of its generation. It definitely tried to pick up some older gamers by porting games like Doom and putting out the now cult classic Conker's Bad Fur Day, but it wasn't winning the popularity contest. So, what did it leave behind? What was the actual legacy of the N64? A console is only as good as its library, and boy is that library stacked with classics. Games that still captivate audiences to this day, that hold legendary renown, but if I talk about every single one of them, this video would be well over an hour long. So, let's just talk about a few. Mario 64, Zelda Ocarina of Time, Mario Kart 64, Super Smash Bros., Pokemon Stadium, and Pokemon Snap. I'm not going to talk about GoldenEye because it's a game I never really played until much, much later in my life, and I know about it more as a game where I'm not supposed to pick the short guy and I'm only supposed to karate chop people, something like that. I don't know. It's a little weird. GoldenEye fans, I love you. You have a great game. It's just not my shtick, alright? So let's start with Mario 64 and talk about how it changed the series forever. You know, light stuff. When developing Mario 64, Nintendo knew that the classic left-to-right formula would be impossible. 3D space just didn't work like that, and a non-3D Mario game at launch would have been detrimental to showing off the graphical capabilities of the N64. Using cartridges instead of CDs meant load times were nearly instant, and while the game couldn't compete on length with other titles like those on its competing systems, like Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation, it could absolutely take on any foe when it came to gameplay. Smooth as butter isn't a term that does enough justice to Mario 64, even today. Jumping, sliding, diving, flying, even ground pounding feels crisp and nearly always intended. Nearly. That should be a very, very large nearly, and it should be in asterisks displayed repeatedly on screen when I say that. Rarely do I ever perform one of these actions by accident, and rarely does anything but the now aged camera control impede my ability to complete an objective. The game places you inside of Peach's castle, which has paintings that take you to individual levels. Sure, it doesn't have over 100 stages, that Super Mario World for the SNES had, but the worlds it does have now have 8 or so objectives to complete that unlock additional parts to the level as you complete some of them. The goal is simple. Beat Bowser. How do you get to him? Complete objectives in each level to earn stars, and when you earn enough stars, you can go to a special Bowser stage. Beat the big bad Koopa in his own domain, and you're on your way to saving the princess. You only need 70 stars to face off against Bowser in the final 1 versus 1 duel, but completing the game with 120 stars gets you the best ending. Each level has its own gimmick. Some are super vertical, some are super slippery, some are super hot, and some are Bob-omb Battlefield. I don't know if any opening level in a video game on any system even compares to Mario 64's opening stage. Bob-omb Battlefield teaches you everything you need to know about the game so perfectly. You can perform certain objectives out of order, you can jump or punch Goombas to get coins, you can use coins to heal damage, and the bosses will always tell you how to beat them. The music is iconic, and the collecting of the first star, even more so. Mario 64 taught everyone who played it how to move in 3D space, how to hold their N64 controller, and most importantly, taught Nintendo about multi-objective, free-roaming level design. Mario Sunshine and Galaxy would follow suit in the next generations of gaming, but the blueprint for their success and fan love comes from the design decisions made in Mario 64. When talking about the titans of Nintendo's storied history, and I'm talking more stories than the Empire State Building here, alright? It's a tall one, and every hot dog stand in a 3-block radius is overpriced as hell. We gotta talk about the Legend of Zelda. Ocarina of Time is an absolute classic, masterpiece, swan song, masterclass. I can't sing its praises enough, and neither can anyone that's played it under 50 times. Speedrunners may be the only people in the world who truly appreciate the beauty of this game, and they even go out of their way to skip 99% of it. The journey from being a meek child in a kingdom so much bigger than yourself and filled with wonder to that of an adult in an oppressive land now controlled by an evil totalitarian that's corrupted the once green fields and fertile lands and filled it with monsters is something that speaks to every single generation and follows the hero's journey almost to a T. I don't really see the refusal to the call, because if you did that in a video game like this, it would be hard to get across since Link never talks, but my god, by the time you get to the absolutely legendary Master Sword, you feel like you've grown as a player, and you're ready for whatever the game has in store. Except you're not, because the game is about to take away half your stuff and send you to a spooky graveyard where you gotta race a ghost guy to get a hook shot. The items are your toys to play with, and the world is your sandbox. The story is classic Zelda and definitely treads a lot of the same ground that the previous game, A Link to the Past, did, but it feels like a 3D remix of an already fantastic title rather than a ripoff. Z-targeting was a genius idea, and now locking onto enemies to keep your sights trained during combat is expected in third-person action games rather than a luxury. Even games known for their incredible difficulty, like Dark Souls, borrow this mechanic from Legend of Zelda. The eerie setting of the Shadow Temple, the adrenaline of sneaking through the Gerudo Fortress, the anger of never being able to get a goddamn bullseye in those mouse bomb minigames in Castletown that would make you consider throwing your controller at your TV screen in your mid-20s, soothing sounds of the Kokiri Forest from the top to bottom. This game made everyone a fan of Legend of Zelda, and is without a doubt one of the single best games of all time. The only thing with Zelda is that it was a single-player game, made for kids who didn't like to share. I know I did. I still don't. No, you can't come over to my house and play N64 with me. You're gonna drive me frickin' Vinny Boombots. Get the hell out of here. For that, we had games like Mario Kart 64 and Super Smash Bros. 64. They kind of go together like peanut butter and jelly, a racing game and a fighting game that weren't exactly traditional racing or fighting games. Mario Kart 64 was a no-brainer when it came to sequels to popular SNES games to put on the console. Mario Kart 64 had you driving the titular karts around 16 tracks at varying speeds and degrees of complexity, like the Yoshi level with the big egg. Everyone remembers that level because at the fastest speed, nobody could navigate it, and the game just gave up trying to figure out who the hell was in what place. It was a complete crapshoot to know if you were in 4th or 29th place, even though there were only like 12 racers. The game had up to 4-player split screen with both competitive racing and battle modes. If you and your friends wanted to have a great night, you'd all get set around the TV with some pizza and a Backstreet Boys CD, and you'd jam out while you rammed your friends with Bowser in Block City. You then shut that boy band crap the hell off because Rainbow Road had a song so good that I have no less than 15 frickin' remixes of it in several of my music playlists on YouTube. Much like that, Smash Brothers was there for you to have a great time with your friends, but it always felt a bit more malicious. If you needed to prove something to your friend, you'd settle it by playing Smash. As a kid, I wasn't privy to the tournament rules because I was like 5, and in kindergarten you're not expected to be able to do more than press B and Falcon Punch, but it was still a fun time. Picking up a Pokeball as Mario and throwing it at Kirby only to accidentally have it kill Link was some of the funniest stuff that could happen as a kid. And even to this day, being able to beat up my friends in Smash Brothers brings me immense pleasure. The two games really go well together, and they're just some of the finest examples of couch co-op. Now, I know Niggy Jakey did a whole video about the death of couch multiplayer, so I won't go too much into that, but know that I 100% agree with his assessment. It's dead for the understandable reasons of the internet and so many other things, and I am glad that I live in an age where I don't have to be seated next to 16 people to play big team battle in Halo. But when friends are over, I'd always rather sit down next to them and finish them off by flossing in their faces rather than having a gamer moment and calling them something that would get me in hotter water than PewDiePie over the internet. Speaking of cultural icons, let's talk about Pokemon. I know, that's the single smoothest transition you've ever seen or heard, and are now impressed with my literary genius. Thank you, humbly, for your support. Pokemon is a subject, in general, that needs its own video. It's literally too big to cover in anything less than 30 minutes when you talk about the entire franchise. It's grossed more than $96 billion, being the highest grossing media franchise of all time. That's more than Mario, more than Star Wars, more than frickin' Mickey Mouse, if you guys can frickin' believe that, alright? Tajiri really hit the nail on the head with that one. If you were a kid in the late 90s and early 2000s, you had Pokemon. You had the games, the cards, the VHS tapes, the Pokemon-themed blanket and bedsheet and pillowcase, the curtains, a Pokemon alarm clock, a Pokemon sticker book, the strategy guides, the toys, the backpacks, the lunchboxes. There was literally no escaping it. Going with your dad to buy some cigarettes at 7-Eleven? For your dad, not you, unless you did as a kid. More power to you, I guess. But you were begging for a pack of cards. Down at Toys R Us, you wanted a Pokemon toy, or the version of the game you didn't have, or one of the many spin-off games. There are 3 spin-off Pokemon games for the N64, Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2, and Pokemon Snap. Pokemon Stadium was something else, and its sequel literally just made everything about the first one better. If you didn't have a Game Boy, you could play the Game Boy games on the included Game Boy cartridges, and then take your friends to the stadium for some one-on-one action. Or you could play a bunch of Mario Party-style minigames with them, but without the board and significantly more interesting characters. Yeah, you know what? That's right, I said it. I don't think Toad is that interesting. He's just a little dude with a mushroom on his head. He probably has a fungal condition, and I'm not looking to catch it. Have you seen healthcare prices in this country? Maron, I'm not looking for anything to do with that, alright? Keep your little mushroom man. I'd much rather have a torso with eyes and legs that look like springs named after Bruce Lee. Seeing Pokemon in 3D meant that as a kid, we could actually tell what the hell they were, which meant that Charizard was even cooler on the silver screen than he was on the tiny greenish Game Boy. Have you ever seen a Mankey sprite from behind, like the first generation versions? Oh my god, he's just noodles. He just looks like pasta. Anyway, so Pokemon Stadium 2 did everything better than Pokemon Stadium 1 and brought the portable craze to the living room after a long day on the playground. You'd come home after trading some Pokemon with your friends at school, watch the newest episode of the TV show, and then turn on the games. It was a lifestyle, and for many people, it still is. Outside of the context of the time, Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2 haven't aged so well. The minigames can still be fun, but nobody I know besides me ever has a Game Boy with a link cable and a desire to fill out their OG Pokedex. So, what if you wanted a standalone Pokemon experience? Pokemon Snap had a new interpretation of the tagline, "Gotta catch 'em all." Catch 'em all on film. It's a rail shooter where you take pictures of Pokemon. The ones where the Pokemon are close and in the middle of the camera gets you points. And after completing certain objectives, you get a new level to ride down. It gave kids a real Steve Irwin complex, like they suddenly knew how Pokemon lived and behaved in these environments, which would somehow help them in their Pokemon journey. They didn't. At no point have I ever had to push an egg into lava to get a Moltres. I just go into a cave and get it there, like a normal person. Yeah, don't you know that birds who fly in the sky like to live in deep, deep caves that probably can't contain their enormous wingspan? What are you, an idiot? The coolest part about that was that when you were done, you could go to Blockbuster and print out your pictures from a picture-to-sticker kiosk while your parents decided what your bedtime could be so they could screw after they watched Titanic on VHS, only to find that the guy before them didn't rewind the goddamn movie. You'd take the stickers and you'd slap them on your notebook or your bed or your backpack for them to just fall off because vinyl backpacks suck for stickers. But you'd put them somewhere and it would be entirely unique to you. Nobody else would have the exact sticker that you had or that picture, but it would be something that everyone else you knew was still somehow connected to through this franchise. And that's how it felt to own an N64 as a kid. You and your classmates, no matter how cool or stylish they were in elementary school, were all connected by this thing that you all had or at least understood. Sure, not every single kid had one, but for those that did, you knew that sharing secrets of where to find a heart container and Ocarina of Time with your friends was just as important as knowing the answer to a question on your math quiz. Beating Mario 64 with 120 stars was just as important as coming in first in a field day event. Beating Trainer Red on Mount Silver in the Gen 2 Pokemon games on your TV in front of your friends was just as important as getting straight A's on your report card. You were part of a community of people who loved games, not as a counterculture, not as something different from other kids, but as a generation of children who were somewhat expected to play them and fall in love with the adventures therein. Whether you were walking into the Deku Tree for the first time, catching your first legendary Pokemon, or having what seemed like an unbeatable time on a track in Mario Kart, the N64 was a shared cultural phenomenon, and every person who's touched it will have fond memories of the time they shared, and the times they shared it with friends. The legacy of the N64 is that of community, is that of friendship, is that of a time we can never go back to, but that we will always know was one of the most kick-ass times in gaming.